There are documents that change the world. Not the speeches delivered to roaring stadium crowds. Not the staged appearances captured for newsreels and propaganda films. Documents, papers, signatures. Sometimes just one page, sometimes a few lines, sometimes nothing more than initials scrawled in pencil in the margin of a report. These weren't written for the public. They weren't read aloud on the radio. Many of them stayed buried so deep that historians only learned they existed after the war, when Allied forces seized the German archives. In these documents is the real Hitler, not the man delivering thunderous speeches about Germany's greatness. The man who signed orders for the murder of human beings with the same casual ease he might have signed a requisition for office supplies. Today, we're going through these documents. The letter that launched a killing program, a program that became a direct rehearsal for the Holocaust. The directive that turned the war in the East into a war of annihilation before the first shot was even fired. The plans that calculated, in cold economic terms, the starvation deaths of tens of millions of people. The orders given verbally, because even Hitler understood that paper trails were dangerous even for him. And we'll look at how historians found these documents decades later, sometimes by accident, sometimes after years of painstaking searching. This isn't conspiracy theory. These are documents sitting in archives right now. They've been studied. They have file numbers, dates, signatures. And they explain, more than any speech ever could, what was actually happening behind the scenes. Let's start with a document that many historians call one of the most chilling in human history. Not because of its length, because of what fit on a single page. October 1939. Germany has just wrapped up the Polish campaign. The war is in full swing, but at this point, it's still a normal war, in the sense of fronts and armies clashing. And at this exact moment, Hitler signs a document that has nothing to do with enemies on the battlefield. It concerns Germany's own citizens. The document is dated September 1st, 1939, but it was actually signed later, in October. The date was deliberately backdated, tying the program to the start of the war, creating the impression that this was some kind of wartime necessity. The text itself is short, essentially a few lines addressed to two men, the head of the Chancellery, Philipp Buller, and Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Karl Brandt. The content: Reichsleiter Buller and Dr. Brandt are authorized to expand the powers of certain physicians so that patients judged incurable, after the most careful assessment of their condition, could be granted a mercy death. Gnadentod, literally, death by grace. This wasn't a military order. This targeted German citizens, people with mental illnesses, congenital disabilities, severe chronic conditions. The program became known as Aktion T4, named after the address of a villa in Berlin that served as its coordination center, Tiergartenstraße 4. Over the next 2 years, this program killed somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 people. German citizens, inside German hospitals and specially designated facilities. The methods developed and tested under T4, gas chambers using carbon monoxide, a systematic selection process, transportation logistics, falsified death certificates. These exact methods were applied on a far larger scale just 2 years later. The staff who carried out the killings under T4, doctors, nurses, technical personnel, many of them were later transferred to work in the death camps in the East. They already had the experience. This is a direct, documented link between two atrocities that are often studied separately. T4 wasn't just a parallel program. It was the technological and personnel rehearsal for the Holocaust. So why was the program officially shut down in 1941? It wasn't Hitler's decision. The program became publicly known. In Germany, despite totalitarian control, rumors spread. Clergy began protesting publicly. The Bishop of Münster, Clemens von Galen, delivered a sermon that spread across the entire country. This was one of the rare instances where domestic resistance inside Germany actually influenced the regime's decisions. Officially, the program was halted in August 1941, but wild euthanasia, killings carried out without formal program structure, more covertly, continued until the end of the war. The letter Hitler signed in October 1939 is one of the few documents where he personally, in his own hand, authorized the killing of civilians. Most of his other decisions he preferred to deliver verbally or through intermediaries, to avoid leaving a paper trail. But this letter survived. And it became one of the key pieces of evidence in subsequent trials against the doctors who took part in the program. Before invading the Soviet Union, the German High Command wasn't just drafting military plans. They were also drafting directives on how German soldiers should behave on Soviet territory. On June 6, 1941, 2 weeks before the start of Operation Barbarossa, a document was issued that became known as the Kommissar Order, the Kommissarbefehl. Formally, this came from the Wehrmacht High Command, but its ideological foundation had been laid out personally by Hitler in a series of meetings with senior commanders that spring. At one of these meetings, on March 30, 1941, attended by more than 200 senior officers, Hitler delivered a speech that was later recorded by participants in their diaries and memoirs. The gist of the speech: the war against the Soviet Union would not be fought like a normal war between states. This would be a war of annihilation, a Vernichtungskrieg. Ideological enemies, commissars, political officers, representatives of Soviet authority would not be protected under the laws of war. The normal rules for treating prisoners of war would not apply to them. Colonel General Halder wrote in his diary after this meeting, "The communist intelligentsia must be eliminated." The Commissar Order formalized this. The text instructed that political commissars of the Red Army, once captured, were to be shot immediately. Not sent to POW camps. Not subjected to standard interrogation procedures. Executed on the spot. This was a direct violation of the Geneva Convention, even of the version Germany hadn't formally signed in relation to the USSR, but which nonetheless defined accepted norms for treating prisoners. The order provoked mixed reactions even among some German officers, not usually for moral reasons, but for practical ones. Some generals worried this would only stiffen Soviet resistance. If surrender meant a guaranteed death sentence for political officers, Soviet soldiers would fight to the last man rather than give up. Still, the order was carried out. Massively. The exact number of political officers and simply people mistakenly or deliberately identified as commissars who were shot can't be precisely calculated. Historians estimate tens of thousands in just the first months of the war. Formally, the order was rescinded in May 1942, but not for moral reasons. German command had concluded the order was counterproductive. It was hardening resistance and reducing the number of voluntary surrenders the Germans wanted for use as HUIs, auxiliary personnel. In other words, rescinding the order wasn't an admission of its criminality. It was a cost-benefit reassessment. Alongside the Commissar Order, another document was issued, less famous to the general public, but no less important for understanding what was being planned in the East. May 13, 1941, the Decree on Exercise of Military Jurisdiction in the Area Barbarossa. This document granted German military personnel, of any rank, legal immunity for crimes committed against civilians on occupied Soviet territory. The wording was brutally direct. Actions taken by Wehrmacht soldiers against civilians of an enemy state were not subject to court-martial, even if those actions constituted a war crime under ordinary military law. Unit commanders were given the authority to decide independently whether to punish subordinates for such actions, and if so, how, without any mandatory judicial process. What did this mean in practice? It meant that killing a civilian, a man, woman, or child, on Soviet territory by a German soldier was not automatically treated as a crime requiring investigation. This created a legal environment in which mass killings, looting, and rape effectively became legal by default. Not because they were directly ordered in every individual case, but because there was no accountability for them. This document is rarely mentioned in general history courses about the war, because it doesn't describe a specific crime. It describes the absence of a mechanism to prevent crimes. But it was precisely that absence of mechanism that allowed millions of individual atrocities to happen with no consequences for the perpetrators. Historians who've studied this document point out that it was one of the factors enabling the phenomenon described in research like Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men. Mass participation by rank-and-file German soldiers in crimes against civilians, not as exceptions, but as a systemic occurrence. This is perhaps the least known of all the documents we're discussing today, and one of the most horrifying in its sheer calculation.
The Hunger Plan. The Hunger Plan. It was drafted in the spring of 1941, before Operation Barbarossa began, by a group of economists and officials under the direction of State Secretary for Food Herbert Backe. This wasn't an order signed directly by Hitler in the strict sense. It was an economic plan that received high-level approval, including Hitler's personal involvement in discussing its principles. The essence of the plan was laid out in documents prepared for a meeting held on May 2, 1941, a month and a half before the war started. A quote from the surviving meeting minutes. "The war can only continue if the entire armed forces are fed from Russia. As a result, tens of millions of people will become superfluous and must die of starvation or emigrate to Siberia. Tens of millions of people will become superfluous and must die of starvation." This is not a metaphor. This is a concrete economic calculation. The plan's logic was as follows. The German army in the east was to be supplied using resources from conquered territory, without adding extra burden to the German domestic economy. The Soviet Union mostly produced food in Ukraine and the southern regions, the so-called surplus zone. The northern industrial regions, including Moscow and Leningrad, depended on supplies from those southern regions through a unified economic system. Break that unified system apart, separate the surplus zone from the deficit zone, and the industrial regions would be left without food. And this wasn't a side effect, it was the goal. The document explicitly stated that urban populations, including Leningrad, Moscow, and other major industrial centers, were to be cut off from food supply. The result? Mass death by starvation. The calculations assumed that in this way, somewhere between 20 and 30 million people would end up superfluous. This plan explains a great deal of what we know about what actually happened during the war. The siege of Leningrad, the directive not to feed Leningraders, documented within Hitler's own inner circle, is a direct consequence of the hunger plan's logic. The city was meant to die of starvation not because it was technically unavoidable, but because that was the point. The treatment of Soviet POs, roughly 3.3 million of approximately 5.7 million captured throughout the war, died in German captivity, most from starvation and disease in the first months, also fits squarely within the logic of the hunger plan. Feeding prisoners meant spending resources that, according to the plan, were supposed to go to the German army, while the surplus population in occupied territories was meant to die off. The hunger plan was never fully implemented. The reality of war proved more complicated than the economists' theoretical calculations. But the direction was set by this exact document, long before the first shot of Operation Barbarossa was fired. This changes our understanding of what happened in the East. This wasn't the side effect of war, a food shortage caused incidentally by military operations. This was part of a plan drawn up in advance, on paper, in numbers and percentages. Generalplan Ost, the master plan for the East. This document existed in several versions, was developed by different agencies over the course of several years, and its complete text has never been found in full. Some parts were destroyed, some remain scattered fragments across various archives. But even the fragments give a sense of the scale.
This was a long-term plan for the Germanization of conquered territories in the east: Poland, the Baltics, Belarus, Ukraine, and the western part of Russia. Here are the core provisions that historians have managed to reconstruct. The Polish population, roughly 80 to 85% of it, was to be deported over the course of several decades, primarily to Siberia or other remote regions. Those who remained were to be used as slave labor, with severely restricted access to education. The population of the Western Soviet regions, same logic, but on an even larger scale. The documents reference figures in the tens of millions of people subject to resettlement, which in practice meant death for a significant portion of these people, either during deportation itself or in destination areas that weren't prepared to absorb such numbers. The liberated territories were to be settled by ethnic Germans. Detailed plans for new German settlements were drawn up, with specific calculations of population size, agricultural methods, and infrastructure.
One of the plan's architects, Professor Konrad Meyer, developed detailed demographic projections: how many German colonists would be needed to settle a given territory, how to organize their resettlement, what crops to grow. It reads like an ordinary agricultural development plan. Except for one detail: to make room for these German colonists, tens of millions of people already living there had to be eliminated. The word eliminate never appears directly as kill in the documents. Euphemisms were used: evacuation, resettlement, natural reduction of population. But the context, especially combined with the hunger plan and the actual practice of occupation, leaves little doubt about what these euphemisms really meant. Generalplan Ost was never fully implemented. Germany lost the war before it could carry out the plan on a large scale.
But individual elements were put into practice. The deportation of Poles from territories annexed to Germany, plans for the Germanization of Crimea, experiments with resettlement around Zamość in Poland, where local populations were forcibly expelled and replaced with German colonists. The fact that it wasn't fully realized doesn't mean it was just theory. It was a program that determined the day-to-day practical actions of the German administration in occupied territories. So far, we've talked about documents originating with the top leadership. But there's another category of document: letters from ordinary German soldiers from the front, which were reviewed by military censors and, in some cases, never sent. These letters hold particular value for historians because they show how orders and directives were perceived at the level of ordinary people carrying them out. German military mail was subject to censorship, selective review. Letters containing overly explicit descriptions of events, or criticism of command, or information that could affect morale back home in Germany, were confiscated and never reached their addressees. These confiscated letters survived in the censorship archives. One such letter, from a soldier identified as Joseph B., who served in a unit conducting actions against the Jewish population in Ukraine in 1942, contains a description of events that censors deemed too explicit to send home. There's no need to quote the content in detail, and it wouldn't serve a purpose. What matters is that such documents exist at all. They show that some German soldiers wrote home about what was happening, openly, without euphemism. This contradicts the post-war narrative that ordinary soldiers knew nothing. They knew. They wrote about it. Censors held these letters back not because the information was secret to the recipients. Relatives in Germany likely knew or suspected a great deal regardless.
Censors held these letters back because too direct a description could undermine the illusion the regime was trying to maintain, the illusion of a clean war. The existence of military censorship archives containing such letters is one source that refutes the myth of "we didn't know." Here's a special case. A document of enormous historical significance, but one for which there's no direct Hitler signature. We're talking about the decision on the final solution to the Jewish question, the decision to move from various forms of persecution and deportation of Jews to systematic physical extermination. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942
is often cited as the moment this decision was formalized. The conference minutes survive and remain one of the key documentary pieces of evidence of the Holocaust. But the Wannsee minutes carry no Hitler signature. He wasn't present at the conference. Heydrich presided.
Historians have spent decades searching. Does a direct written order from Hitler initiating the systematic murder of European Jews exist? Such a document hasn't been found. And in the view of most historians, it likely never existed as a single written, signed order. Why? This is one of the most debated topics in Holocaust historiography, the so-called dispute between intentionalists and functionalists. Intentionalists argue that the decision to exterminate was made by Hitler personally, verbally, in a small circle, and then passed down through a chain of subordinates without ever leaving a written trace. The explanation is that Hitler understood perfectly well that a written order for mass murder would be irrefutable evidence of a crime. He avoided paper trails on the most sensitive matters. Functionalists suggest a more complex process, a gradual radicalization through a series of decisions made at different levels, with no single central order, as a cumulative result of ideology, the military situation, and bureaucratic momentum. Most modern historians lean toward a synthesis, that the decision genuinely originated with Hitler, was expressed verbally at key moments in the fall of 1941, but its implementation was a process involving numerous officials at various levels, each making their own decisions within the overall direction set from above. Indirect documentary traces exist. Diary entries from officials who attended meetings with Hitler and recorded his statements, not as direct quotes, but as paraphrases of meaning. Goebbels recorded in his diary in December 1941 a phrase he attributed to Hitler about the Führer's prophecy regarding the fate of the Jews being fulfilled.
This referred to Hitler's Reichstag speech in January 1939, where he threatened Jews with annihilation if they provoked another world war. This isn't an order in the legal sense, but for the regime's functionaries, people who had worked within the system for years and understood the signals, it was enough. The absence of a single written order for the Holocaust isn't evidence that Hitler bears no responsibility. It's evidence of how sophisticated the system was, allowing top leadership to set the direction while avoiding direct documentary accountability. March 1945. The war is essentially lost. Soviet forces are on the Oder, the Allies are crossing the Rhine, and at this moment, Hitler issues a document that many historians consider one of the most irrational decisions of the entire war. On March 19, 1945, an order known as the Nero Decree, the Nero Befehl, named after the legend of the Roman emperor said to have burned Rome.
The order's content. On German territory that might fall into enemy hands, all objects of military, transportation, communications, or economic value were to be destroyed. Factories, bridges, power plants, water systems, railways, food storage facilities, all of them. The order's logic was literally a scorched earth policy, but applied not to enemy territory, but to Germany's own country. If Germany was losing, it should leave the victors nothing functional. No infrastructure, no way for the German population to live normally after surrender. This would have meant starvation, no electricity, no transportation, for millions of Germans who were already living through the final terrible months of the war. Armaments Minister Albert Speer, one of the people closest to Hitler in the war's final years, found himself in a unique position. According to his own post-war claims, he actively worked to undermine the implementation of this order. Speer traveled around the country, trying to convince local Gauleiters and military commanders not to carry out the order, or to comply only nominally, simulating destruction without actually wrecking the infrastructure. How genuine Speer's post-war claims about his role actually were is a matter of historical debate. At the Nuremberg trials, Speer presented himself as someone who tried to mitigate the war's damage in its final months, which helped him receive a relatively lighter sentence compared to other defendants. But regardless of Speer's motives, the fact remains that the Nero decree wasn't carried out at the scale originally intended. A significant portion of German infrastructure survived to the end of the war, which paradoxically accelerated Germany's post-war recovery. This order reveals Hitler's psychological state in the war's final months. If victory was impossible, then there should be no future for Germany without him either. Total destruction as a final act.
This connects directly to his own testament and decision to take his own life. The logic was unified. If the world wasn't going to belong to him, then it shouldn't belong to anyone in working order. After Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, his successor, according to his political testament, became Admiral Karl Dönitz. This appointment itself was contained in one of the last documents Hitler signed, the political testament drafted in his final days in the bunker. Why Dönitz and not one of the more prominent Nazi leaders, Göring, Himmler? Göring had been declared a traitor after sending a telegram requesting authority to assume leadership. Hitler interpreted this as an attempted power grab. Himmler had been conducting secret negotiations with the Allies about a possible surrender on the Western Front, without Hitler's approval. This too was seen as betrayal. Dönitz, commander of the Navy, a man who remained loyal to the end, not entangled in the internal intrigues of the Nazi leadership, turned out to be the only candidate Hitler could place any trust in during his final days. Hitler's testament, a document that survived and was discovered by the Allies, contains a characteristic mixture: personal instructions regarding his marriage to Eva Braun, political instructions about the composition of the new government, and a final accusation against everyone around him of betrayal, an explanation of defeat as treachery rather than military causes. A document meant to determine the future, but determining instead the final days of a state that had only days left to live. Dönitz led the government for only about 2 weeks, until the final surrender on May 8. His main task in those days was organizing the largest possible evacuation of German troops and civilians from the Eastern Front to the west, so they would surrender to the Western Allies rather than to Soviet forces. This was the final practical outcome of the entire chain of documents and decisions made over many years. Not victory, not a new order, not the 1000-year Reich, but an organized flight from one set of victors to another, in hopes that captivity under one would be less terrible than captivity under the other. Many of the documents we've discussed weren't found through deliberate targeted searches. They were found by accident or near accident. After Germany's surrender, the Allies seized an enormous volume of documentation. German bureaucracy was among the most thorough in history. Everything was recorded, registered, filed.
Some archives were destroyed by the Germans themselves in the war's final days, particularly documents that could serve as direct evidence of crimes. But destroying everything turned out to be impossible. The scale of the bureaucracy was simply too vast. Some archives were found in mines. Germany made extensive use of salt and coal mines as bomb-proof storage facilities. After the war, the Allies methodically searched these mines and found not only gold and artwork, but tons of documents. Some archives were found in castles, in Bavaria, in Austria, where various ministries and agencies had been evacuated in the war's final months. The Wannsee Conference documents, that very protocol, were found in 1947, during preparations for one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials, in the archives of the Foreign Ministry. One of 30 copies that had been distributed to various agencies, and it survived.
The Hunger Plan documents were assembled from various sources over decades after the war, many surfacing only in the 1990s, when Allied archives were declassified. Archives that some countries had kept restricted for years, sometimes for reasons of secrecy related not to World War II itself, but to the subsequent Cold War. Some documents ended up in Soviet archives, seized by the Red Army during the advance and capture of Berlin.
These archives remained closed to Western researchers until the 1990s. After they opened, documents emerged that supplemented, and sometimes corrected, the picture Western historians had assembled based on documents captured by the Western allies. This process, the gradual discovery, study, and cross-referencing of documents from different archives in different countries, continues to this day. Every few years, new publications appear based on documents found relatively recently or reinterpreted in new ways. The history isn't finished. The archives are still talking. There's a question that troubles many researchers, and many ordinary people encountering these documents for the first time. What does a signature actually mean? On one hand, a signature is a legal fact. A document bearing Hitler's signature is direct evidence of his personal responsibility for a specific decision. On the other hand, most of the mass atrocities of the Nazi regime have no direct Hitler signature under a specific order for their commission. The Holocaust, the most infamous crime of the 20th century, formally lacks such a document. Does that make Hitler less responsible for the Holocaust than, say, for the T4 program, which he signed personally? Most historians answer no.
The system was built so that the leader set the overall direction, the overall ideology, the overall spirit, while the people carrying it out at the local level understood what was expected of them and acted accordingly, sometimes even exceeding what would have been formally ordered, because they understood this would be approved. Historian Ian Kershaw described this phenomenon as working towards the Führer, Arbeiten auf den Führer entgegen. Officials and functionaries at every level of the regime tried to anticipate what the Führer would want and acted in that direction, often without direct instructions, sometimes even without his awareness of the specific details. This created a system in which responsibility was distributed, but not diffused. Each individual who carried out an action bore responsibility for their own actions. And the system as a whole, meaning the man who created it and from whom it drew its inspiration, bore responsibility for creating the conditions under which these actions became possible, expected, and ultimately mass-scale. The absence of a signature on one document doesn't absolve responsibility for a system that produced thousands of documents and tens of millions of victims. The documents we've discussed today are paper, typewritten text, stamps, signatures, sometimes full names, sometimes initials, sometimes just a notation scrawled in the margin. Paper that sat in mines, in castles, in archives, sometimes for decades, before being found and read. What makes these documents important isn't the paper itself, it's what stands behind it. Behind the letter on euthanasia, tens of thousands of murdered people with disabilities and mental illnesses. Real people whose names appeared in hospital records, records that in most cases also didn't survive. Behind the hunger. Plan. Millions of people in Leningrad, in POW camps, in occupied territories, who died of starvation according to economic calculations drawn up in advance. Behind the Commissar order. Thousands shot without trial, without the right to a defense, without anyone ever knowing their names. Behind Generalplan Ost. A planned future that never arrived for entire peoples, because the war ended before this plan could be fully implemented. But which explains the logic of what was happening to those peoples during the years of occupation. These documents matter not because they're secret in some sensationalist sense. They matter because they're evidence. Evidence that crimes on this scale weren't accidents, weren't wartime excesses, weren't the result of blind mob hatred. These were planned, calculated, documented decisions. With dates, with signatures, with economic calculations expressed in percentages and tons. Evil capable of drawing up a chart of how many millions of people must die for economic efficiency is evil of a different order than spontaneous brutality. This is bureaucratic evil. The evil of offices and meetings, evil that wears a suit,
and signs documents in neat handwriting. And precisely because this evil was bureaucratic, documented, calculated, it left traces. Traces that are still being found in mines, in castles, in archives. Paper that remembers what people would rather forget. And as long as these documents exist, and as long as people keep reading them, forgetting completely won't be possible. This is perhaps the only justice that history can offer those who became numbers in these calculations. They're remembered.
Through the very documents that planned their destruction. A bitter irony, but justice nonetheless. If this video mattered to you, hit like, drop a comment. Which of these documents was new to you? History written on paper is no less real than history written in blood, but sometimes it takes more effort to read it. To remember is to read to the end, even when it's hard.